So, so as we start our class, and really a class on global issues, it's a deep class. We're gonna really wrestle with some of the most important concepts I think you guys will come across as students. But it also is important before we dive into global issues to talk first about, quite frankly, what it means to be studying international studies. And whether you're a major in international studies, whether you're minoring in international studies, whether you're taking it as one of those key important electives, or quite frankly, whether it's an emphasis within the Bachelor of General Studies at Georgia Southern University, having a handle on what international studies mean is going to be real critical. So kind of a working definition of international studies is it's the broad array of human relationships that involve cross-border interactions. And that definition is one we need to break through a little bit, because it's really the study of people, and it's the study of looking at people and how they interact with one another and those relationships that we share. But it's really attempting to look at it through a whole series of borders that are out there. You know, it's a major that's very different from, and it's of course a study very different from international relations and emphasis on politics, which it offers its own unique way to examine the challenges of a global world order. It's designed to try and give folks a new identity that is responsive to the environment. And of course, the study, it's a field of inquiry that is incredibly multidisciplinary. It draws from anthropology, certainly business, communication, economics, healthcare, languages, history, geography, literature, religion, sociology, and of course political science too. And the relationships among those different disciplines, while they're very difficult to know how to manage, part of what we want to do is look at the world through multiple lenses and to realize that, listen, no single discipline, at least at the university level, has a monopoly on what it means to be studying things international. So we need to break down this concept of borders of international studies. I think it's a very helpful way in which to look at it. And there's several borders we want to talk about. First of all, let's talk about political borders. And when we talk about political borders, we're really talking about states. That's what political borders form. And if you look at the map, first of all, that I've had in front of you, maps do, first of all, so many things to influence how we see the world and how we see the planet. But this particular map, while it's centered along Europe and Africa in the middle, these borders that you see on the map are literally the division of the states that are in the world. And that's a real important one to know, to look at. First of all, while states may have been with us a long time, there are almost some 200 states today. I think one part that's very important to look at is around World War I, we may have had 30 to 40 different states. And by the time World War II comes about, we're looking at around 50 to 60 states. By the time World War II ends, and certainly not long after, the world has about 150, 160 different states. With almost 200 different states today, understanding how people interact with those state identities, their citizenship, is one very important part of international studies. We've given you a couple other maps here to look about. Again, all political borders, but it is interesting to note how those political borders shape the way in which we see the world. Here's one that has the Americas in the center, one with a little more of a flat map that you can see everybody. And of course, we get some distortions. We get that problem with the Greenland effect because we're trying to put a round planet in terms of things that are flat. It makes Greenland look almost the size of Africa when those sizes are nothing quite like that. So it really can distort perspectives. Here's a map of that's much more Asia specific, or centric, I should say. And again, it does change how we see the world if we think of Australia in the middle and those. Why don't we think of the Arctic, for example, in the center? When you put a round surface on something that's flat, it can certainly distort it. And such is the challenge we're looking at the globe in general, but it certainly affects with why we think about proximities with regard to political borders. The second border I want to call your attention to is our cultural borders. And the unit that cultures form are really nations. And that's different than a state. And I know we have this phrase, nation state, and we think they're one and the same. And for the most part, we can use them simultaneously in some of our languages, but it sometimes can get in the way. Because while states as a political construct, and we really focus on the governments of the world and how they interact, nations takes us much more to a nuanced cultural way of looking at the world. And the nation can be defined in lots of ways. I think some of the more common ways the nation gets defined in terms of language, ethnicity, race, and religion, and even a common historical experience. And one of the things about our borders of the world is they're difficult to put on maps. Here you can see the geography of the world and the land masses and where these oceans are. And this is a particular one that just looks at religions of the world. Now, if you'll notice how the religious borders are superimposed on some of the existing political borders that you can see, and cultural borders and state borders rarely match up, and so much of the challenge of the world have been trying to understand that. For example, let's look at this group, page that came out of a textbook on just the ethnic groups in Africa. And this particular study was done years earlier, and there were found hundreds of different cultural borders, different nations. And again, these two researchers define those and they're using their own definition. But so much of understanding the African continent in general is knowing that how these state borders and cultural borders, again, political borders rather than cultural borders, and how states, governments, controlled by governments, and nations really don't match up. And that has led to a tremendous amount of turmoil and conflict. And understanding that those two different borders are also part and parcel about how we interact with one another is an important part of understanding international studies. Again, you can see it here in the map of Africa, in which it's a map of languages rather than religion. Makes that same point. The third border, at least we want to introduce today when we talk about international studies, is our economic borders. And economic borders are really just the exchange of goods and services. And, to use a simplistic version of it, what those form are markets. And who trades with whom and where individuals get the things that they consume and produce is certainly falls under that definition of international studies. And that's one we want folks and our students to know about. If you look at this map, and I mean, economic transactions are certainly difficult to look at, but this particular map at least offers us some sense of exchange of goods and services, and it's looking at some of those where those routes are occurring, and you can see where some of that heaviest traffic is occurring. And in fact, as the world has become more globalized and there's more trading going on, you can see where those points are. One of the things I think this map does a fine job of emphasizing is that while there's certainly some parts of the world that trade a great deal more than others, and you can see how important some of those points of entry are, how they happen amongst coasts. Some are more internal, but you also get some sense of who's trading and who's not. You can certainly see that divide between the North and the South a little bit in terms of the intensity of those trades amongst our economic borders. Here's a world map, for example, that tries to show the world in both some of the political borders that have existed over time, and it's one that's just looking at political borders from 1880 to 1914. You can see those political borders are much different than the ones we see contemporary, but you can see how those borders were fewer in number during that time, and the point we were making earlier. Again, to give you some sense about the markets that were forming during those times and where those economic borders existed. The fourth border of international studies that we want to draw your attention to are social borders. And it doesn't take Marxist analysis to at least recognize that class is a real critical component to understanding how people potentially identify themselves. And where those social borders exist in the world are very important. And in fact, there are some things that there are people from an economic standpoint that may find themselves far more in common with one another by folks that live in Tokyo and London and New York City than they do from a class standpoint than they do with people living within a mile from where they are, who they might not have as much common with from a class standpoint. For example, someone who lives in is homeless in a particular part of the world, or living very destitute or moderate income means, may recognize that people they have much more in common with people in parts of the world from a class standpoint than they share from a political, culture, or economic standpoint. This particular map is one that just looks at the United States, and it's really taken some political boundaries in the U.S. We can even break those down further by counties, and looking at just by income to offer some sense of the social borders that exist, potentially at least defined by counties within the United States. And I think that sort of tells its own story. This is an old map of London. One of the first times it was ever done, it was tried to map. And even though the map's a little hard to read, it's quite old, several hundred years old, where it tries to map some of the borders by class in that particular city. And you can see it there in that in a different sense. Again, trying to map those things out. And such borders are very difficult to define because they're not clean. They're certainly more nuanced. The fifth border that I want to do is really a geographic border. In some ways, this one is much easier. You know, if you think about viewing the world from space and what it looks like, you know, there's a lot of the land masses and body of waters are easy to see, and you know, rivers and deserts, mountains, they can all be readily identified. But you know, we could also talk about the lithosphere, the stratosphere, and the ozone layer. Those are all important parts of the Earth's ecological system, and they really have effect where humans have settled in degree to how they interact and certainly how they identify each other too. But even these borders change over time. It's sort of easy to see where political borders and cultural borders and economic borders and social borders have changed with time and how they're difficult to do. But even geographic borders are altered. Volcanoes and glaciers and rivers, when they meander, all have altered the landscapes. Today we deal with the environmental impact of melting ice caps and wetlands that might be retreating and deserts that are growing. And such borders have shifted. Part of the challenge here is trying to figure out what causes them to shift. How much of that has been about humans increasingly living in large numbers, certainly bigger than they once did, and how all those examples hit us, whether they're places that are sort of prone to wildfire. We see that in some of the American West, or whether they're places that are prone to flooding, which we can see in many places around the world, Bangladesh perhaps in the monsoon season being some of the more important ones, or at least easy examples to see. You know, this is a map that sort of shows those geographic borders. We can see our deserts and mountains and oceans where they exist. Again, part of the easier one to see. The example I gave you earlier about putting things on a flat surface, you can see the problem there with Greenland, where in this particular map, Africa and Greenland, those sizes are not as distorted a great deal either. And I guess the final border that we want to mention, at least for the purposes of understanding the borders of international studies, are technological borders. And those borders, if you can sort of think of them as who's connected and who's not. I mean, technology has been one of those more transformative ways in which people can interact with one another and cross these borders. But it strikes that the technological borders are best symbolized by the revolution in telecommunications, the presence of the internet, and all those things. And even just over 100 years ago, you know, the transition from a society that was much more physically mobile with cars and planes and radio and television to the ways in which today computers and cell phones bridge that divide, and who has them and who doesn't have that kind of technology. You know, many of you that are listening to this lecture today have multiple email addresses and cell phones. and TVs, and you have many in your house, and you still have an entire planet, though, that has never placed nor received a telephone call. And so our map here, or the picture here, really gives you a sense of that technological divide. And you can see it's growing around the world with the picture, and sort of speaks for itself. The point of all this is that when you think about international studies and the borders of international studies, we all identify ourselves in many ways, and understanding the way in which those human relationships come together across these many borders are going to be a real critical one for understanding everything that we do going forward.